There is a moment when the Sinaloa Cartels stopped being just a criminal organization and became something else entirely, something larger, something that no longer fit neatly inside the language people use to describe crime. Not a gang, not even a cartel in the traditional sense, something closer to what you'd call a parallel power, a shadow structure operating inside the same geography as a nation-state, using the same roads, the same cities, the same ports, but running on completely different rules. Rules written in money, enforced by fear, and protected by a silence so deep and so institutionalized that for decades, entire regions of Mexico function not under the authority of the Mexican government, but under the authority of a criminal empire that had made itself indistinguishable from the landscape itself. They didn't just operate inside Mexico. They owned it. And here's something no one actually talks about. When people say the Sinaloa Cartel owns Mexico, they're not speaking loosely. They're trying to describe something real, something documented, reported, and witnessed by journalists, researchers, prosecutors, and survivors across more than 40 years of modern Mexican history. The scale of money alone is almost impossible to process. Estimates from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and various American federal agencies have placed the cartel's annual revenues in the billions, with some figures suggesting the organization has generated more wealth than the GDP of several small nations combined. And that money didn't just circulate in the shadows. It moved through real estate, agriculture, construction, transportation, and finance. It touched almost every sector of economic life in northwestern Mexico. It funded campaigns, bought silence, built roads, employed communities, and made itself, at various points, more reliable as a source of order than the government itself. But I assure you the real story lies in the details the headlines almost never reach. The decades of careful construction, the alliances forged in prison yards and mountain villages, the internal wars that reshaped everything, and the kind of life that existed inside that world for the people closest to its center. That's what we're going to get into today. Because understanding how an organization reaches this level and what that world actually looks like from the inside tells you something not just about crime in Mexico, but about power, money, and human nature itself. Before we get into the full picture, I need you to first understand where this all began, because nothing about the Sinaloa Cartel's rise was accidental. It came out of a very specific geography, a very specific history, and conditions that had been building for generations before anyone called it a cartel at all. The state of Sinaloa sits on Mexico's Pacific coast, nestled between the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains to the east and the Gulf of California to the west. For most of the 20th century, it was known as an agricultural state. Rich soil, river valleys, cattle ranches, and a coastline that fed fishing communities for generations. But the mountains told a different story. Deep in the Sierra Madre, isolated communities had been growing opium poppies since at least the early 1900s, when Chinese immigrants brought the practice to Mexico during the construction of the railway system. By the mid-20th century, poppy cultivation had become deeply embedded in the rural culture of the Golden Triangle, the mountainous region where the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet. This was not a region that had many options. Poverty was severe, government presence was minimal, and the crops that grew best in those highlands happened to be the ones that the outside world was willing to pay the most for. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Mexican drug traffickers began establishing themselves as middlemen between South American cocaine producers and the enormous American consumer market to the north. But for the people of the Golden Triangle, the trade was older and more personal than that. Marijuana and heroin had been flowing out of those mountains for decades, passed through networks of families and communities who had built their entire economic lives around the trade. These weren't corporate criminals operating with spreadsheets and org charts. They were subsistence farmers and small-time smugglers who had found the one crop that could lift them out of poverty, and they were willing to protect it with everything they had. By the 1970s, American drug enforcement pressure had dismantled several major trafficking corridors, and Mexican traffickers, particularly those from Sinaloa, began moving into the vacuum. A new generation of operators emerged, more organized, more ambitious, and more willing to build the kind of infrastructure that could move product at scale. One of the key figures of this transitional era was a man named Miguel Angel Flix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Flix Gallardo came from Sinaloa and spent years cultivating relationships with both the traffickers in the mountains and the political establishment in Mexico City. He understood that the drug trade, at the level he wanted to operate it, required not just smuggling skills, but political protection. And through the 1970s and into the 1980s, he built exactly that, a vast network known as the Guadalajara Cartel, which at its peak functioned as the central coordinating body for almost all major drug trafficking in Mexico. The Guadalajara Cartel operated with a kind of license from the Mexican state that is difficult to fully comprehend from the outside. Researchers and journalists who have documented this era describe a system in which the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, Mexico's federal security directorate, essentially acted as a protector and facilitator for major trafficking operations in exchange for cash payments and information on political dissidents. The traffickers and the state were not enemies. They were, at various points, partners. This relationship would shape everything that followed. In 1985, that arrangement fractured catastrophically when agents working for Flix Gallardo tortured and murdered DEA agent Enrique Camarena Salazar. The killing brought enormous American pressure down on Mexico and forced the government to take visible action. Flix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, and before he went to prison, reportedly from his prison cell, in meetings conducted through intermediaries, he divided his empire. Different trafficking corridors and territories were assigned to different associates. The Pacific Corridor, running through Sinaloa, went to a group of traffickers who would eventually form the foundation of what the world would come to know as the Sinaloa Cartel. Among the figures who emerged from that transition were Dr. Luis Palma Salazar, known as El Hero Palma, and a man from a small mountain village called La Tuna in the municipality of Badiraguato, who went by the name Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera. The world would later know him simply as El Chapo. Now here's where things get interesting, because Chapo's early rise was not a story of sudden dominance. It was a story of survival, patience, and brutal adaptability in an environment where every alliance could turn into a war overnight. Born in 1957 into a poor farming family in the Sierra Madre, Guzman entered the drug trade as a young man working logistics and transportation for Flix Gallardo's network. He was reportedly precise, reliable, and completely ruthless when he needed to be. Qualities that allowed him to move up quickly through an organization that rewarded competence as much as loyalty. By the time Flix Gallardo's empire was divided in 1989, Guzman had positioned himself as one of the key figures inheriting the Sinaloa corridor. But the division of the old Guadalajara cartel didn't bring peace. It brought war. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw a series of violent confrontations between the trafficking groups that had emerged from the old network. Most notably, a feud between the Sinaloa faction and the Tijuana-based Arellano Flix organization that would claim hundreds of lives and culminate in one of the most shocking events in Mexican criminal history. On May 24, 1993, at the Guadalajara International Airport, gunmen linked to the Arellano Flix organization attempted to assassinate Chapo Guzman. They missed Guzman, but killed Cardinal Juan Jes Posadas Ocampo in the crossfire, an event that stunned the nation and brought an intensity of government pressure that Guzman could not escape. He was arrested in Guatemala shortly after and extradited to Mexico, where he was sentenced to more than 20 years in federal prison. And here's the part that might prison for Joaquin Guzman was not the end. It was barely an interruption. From inside the Puente Grande maximum security facility in Jalisco, Guzman allegedly continued managing significant aspects of his operation, cultivating relationships with prison staff, maintaining contact with his outside organization, and living in conditions that bore almost no resemblance to what the public imagined when they heard the words maximum security prison. Investigators and journalists who documented this period describe a man who had access to alcohol, women, gourmet food, and cell phones, operating with a freedom inside prison walls that reflected just how thoroughly money and influence had penetrated the Mexican correctional system. On January 19, 2001, one day before he was scheduled to be transferred to a prison closer to the American border, where extradition would become more likely, Guzman walked out of Puente Grande in a laundry cart. That's the version most commonly told. What's certain is that he left, that prison staff facilitated his escape, and that he returned to the mountains of Sinaloa, where he would spend the next 13 years rebuilding and expanding his organization into something that dwarfed anything that had existed before. The decade that followed Chapo's escape would transform the Sinaloa Cartel from a powerful regional trafficking organization into something approaching the global criminal enterprise that security analysts and law enforcement agencies would later describe with a kind of awed exhaustion. This expansion happened along several parallel tracks simultaneously, and understanding them helps explain how the organization reached the scale it eventually achieved. The first track was infrastructure. The Sinaloa Cartel under Guzman became famous for the sophistication of its smuggling methods and engineering achievement, in a perverse sense, that reflected serious investment and planning. American and Mexican authorities have documented hundreds of cross-border tunnels attributed to Sinaloa over the years, many of them equipped with rail systems, ventilation, electricity, and hydraulic doors. Some stretched for more than half a mile. The tunnel discovered beneath the Otay Mesa border crossing in 2011 was described by federal agents as the most sophisticated ever found at that point. Nearly a third of a mile long, with reinforced walls, a ventilation system, and a rail cart used to move product. It was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of what happens when an organization with essentially unlimited capital decides to solve a logistics problem with engineering. Beyond tunnels, the organization used semi-submersible vessels, Narco submarines, built in jungle workshops in Colombia and Ecuador, to move multi-ton cocaine shipments up the Pacific coast toward Mexico. These vessels were not improvised. They were purpose-built, capable of traveling thousands of miles while sitting low enough in the water to evade radar detection. Crewed by men who understood they would scuttle the vessel if intercepted and rely on the cartel's network to manage the fallout. The organization also used ultralight aircraft flying below radar coverage to cross the border at night. Commercial shipping containers with false compartments built into the walls and floors. Catapults mounted on border fences to hurl bundles of drugs across in seconds. And human couriers, men, women, and sometimes teenagers, who crossed through official ports of entry, carrying product concealed in their bodies, their clothing, or vehicles with specially constructed hidden spaces. An endlessly adaptive series of innovations that seemed to stay one step ahead of interdiction efforts for years at a time. A United States Senate subcommittee report from 2011 described Sinaloa as operating with the logistical complexity of a multinational corporation, an organization capable of moving tonnage, managing supply chains across multiple countries, and absorbing the loss of any single operation without disrupting the broader business. The second track was financial. The money generated by the Sinaloa Cartel was so enormous that laundering it became one of the organization's most significant operational challenges. Investigators from the U.S. Treasury Department, the DEA, and international financial intelligence units have documented a range of methods used to move cartel money into the legitimate economy. Bulk cash smuggling back across the American border, trade-based money laundering through import-export businesses, real estate purchases, agricultural investment, and the use of money service businesses. A 2010 report from the Rand Corporation estimated that Mexican drug trafficking organizations collectively generated somewhere between $19 and $29 billion annually from American drug sales alone. And while that figure represents the total across multiple organizations, the Sinaloa Cartel was widely described as the largest single entity within that ecosystem. The third track was political. This is perhaps the most documented and most disturbing dimension of the cartel's expansion, because it goes to the heart of what people mean when they say the cartel operates like a parallel state. Researchers and journalists who have spent decades covering organized crime in Mexico have documented what they describe as a systemic penetration of Mexican institutions, federal, state, and municipal. This was not simply corruption in the sense of individual officials taking bribes. Something closer to a governance structure in which political power and cartel power were intertwined to the point of being functionally inseparable. There were municipalities in Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and other cartel-influenced states. The police chief and the local judiciary were all operating under the same roof, providing protection and ensuring that the organization's business continued without interference. The phrase that researchers and analysts use for this is capture, the capture of state institutions by criminal organizations. And in parts of northwestern Mexico during the peak years of Sinaloa's dominance, a joint report published by several Mexican academic institutions in 2012 described entire regions where the cartel had effectively replaced the state as the primary provider of order, dispute resolution, employment, and social services, creating what one researcher called narco governance, a system in which criminal organizations performed functions that governments normally perform in exchange for compliance and silence. Because the Sinaloa Cartel was not operating in a vacuum, happened in the context of a brutal, multi-sided war between Mexican trafficking organizations and reshaped the entire criminal geography of the country. The dissolution of the old Guadalajara cartel model had created competing power centers, and through the 1990s and 2000s, those power centers came into increasingly violent conflict. The Gulf Cartel, the Jerez Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, a paramilitary organization formed by former Mexican Army Special Forces who had originally been hired as enforcers for the Gulf Cartel, all fought for control of trafficking corridors, border crossings, and the political protection those routes provided. The Sinaloa Cartel was not just a participant in these conflicts. According to DIA reporting and Mexican government analyses, it was frequently the most capable combatant and more willing to use strategic alliances to gain advantages over its enemies. At various points, the Sinaloa organization was reported with elements of the Mexican military and federal police that allowed it to direct enforcement pressure against its rivals while protecting its own operations. This is one of the most contested and difficult to verify aspects of the cartel's history, but it has been documented in enough detail that it represents more than speculation. The idea that the Mexican government's drug war was, in certain periods and in certain regions, as much a tool of inter-cartel competition, it is documented in the findings of congressional investigations, journalistic investigations, and court proceedings in both Mexico and the United States. Now I need you to understand what was built inside all of this, because this is where the story shifts from politics and logistics, the wealth generated by the Sinaloa Cartel that became one of the most recognizable and widely discussed aspects of organized crime in the modern era. And 'cause so much of it has been documented in court proceedings, journalistic investigations, and the testimonies of people who lived inside that world. Joaquin Guzman, at the height of his power and freedom in the mountains of Sinaloa, operated out of a series of residences and compounds spread across remote areas of the Golden Triangle for their inaccessibility to government forces. Accounts from people who visited or were held in these locations describe properties that combined the aesthetics of Mexican ranching culture with the resources of someone who had essentially unlimited money, satellite dishes and internet connections, stables with thoroughbred horses, security perimeters staffed by teams of armed men operating on rotating shifts, kitchens staffed by cooks who prepared food to order, and an infrastructure of communication and intelligence that would have been impressive for a small government agency. Monitoring systems, advanced warning networks spread across entire mountain ranges, designed to move the principal within minutes. Court documents from Guzum's eventual trial in the Eastern District of New York paint a picture of a man who had constructed around himself a kind of mobile luxury existence, one that could be collapsed and relocated on short notice, but that, when stable, included almost everything money could buy. Former associates testified about properties in Culiacan, Sinaloa's state capital, houses with hidden rooms and escape tunnels built directly beneath them, some equipped with hydraulic doors in the floor of bathroom showers that opened into underground corridors. Witnesses described cars, and there were many of them, armored SUVs, luxury sedans, vehicles outfitted with communications equipment and weapons caches. One account referenced a fleet of vehicles and several high-end pickups that had become, in the narco culture of northwestern Mexico, symbols of status, as recognizable as designer clothing. And speaking of clothing, the culture of display that developed inside the upper levels of the Sinaloa organization deserves its own consideration, because it became one of the primary ways the outside world formed its mental image of what cartel life actually looked like. What became known as narco cultura fused traditional norteo and ranchero identity with conspicuous consumption in a way that was very specifically Mexican and very specifically tied to the geography and history of the Golden Triangle. Expensive boots made from exotic leathers, custom belt buckles encrusted with gemstones, gold watches and gold chains worn not as subtle accessories but as declarations. A style of dress that communicated, unmistakably and deliberately, that the person wearing it had money and the protection to display it publicly. This aesthetic extended to music. The narco corrido, a ballad form rooted in the traditional corrido, which had been used for centuries to celebrate bandits, rebels, and heroes of the Mexican countryside, became the soundtrack of cartel culture. Bands like Los Tigres del Norte, Los Tucanes de Tijuana, and Lupillo Rivera recorded songs that celebrated specific cartel figures by name, commemorated battles, mourned fallen members, and glorified the lifestyle of trafficking with an openness that was, to outsiders, often shocking. But within the communities of the Golden Triangle and the broader Norteo culture, these songs were not propaganda. They were part of an oral tradition that had always celebrated those who operated outside the official order, a tradition of honoring people who, in communities where the state had never provided much, had provided something. Private aircraft became one of the most potent symbols of cartel wealth in this era, because they represented a kind of freedom that money could buy literally. The ability to move across borders and territories without using roads, without passing through checkpoints, without being subject to the geography that constrained everyone else. Court documents, DIA reports, and journalistic investigations have documented dozens of aircraft linked to major Sinaloa figures over the years, ranging from small Cessnas used for local movement to larger turboprops and jets used for international travel. The possession and operation of private aircraft was connected to the broader logistics infrastructure of the organization, but it also functioned as a status marker, evidence, visible in the skies over rural Sinaloa, of how far beyond normal life the people at the top of this organization had traveled. There were ranches, and this is important to understand because the ranch in Mexican culture carries a specific meaning that is different from what the word suggests to someone from outside. The rancho is not just a piece of land. It is a statement of identity, of roots, of belonging to a specific place and tradition. Major cartel figures invested heavily in ranches across the Golden Triangle and beyond, properties that served practical purposes as staging grounds and storage facilities, but that also connected their owners to a cultural narrative of the self-made man of the land. Some of these properties were described by investigators as fortified compounds equipped with sophisticated communications and surveillance technology. Others were working agricultural operations that employed dozens of people from surrounding communities. The line between cartel infrastructure and legitimate rural enterprise was, in many cases, deliberately blurred. Now listen closely, cuz what I'm going to say next about the social dimension of cartel power brings everything together. One of the most consistently reported aspects of Sinaloa cartel dominance in its home territory is the degree to which the organization functioned as an economic engine and, in some communities, a social welfare provider. This is not romanticization. It is a documented reality that appears in academic studies, government reports, and the accounts of residents from Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango. In communities where poppy cultivation was the primary economic activity, cartel organizations provided stability, employment, dispute resolution, and a kind of rough order that the state never had the presence or the will to provide. When Guzman was at large, stories circulated, many of them impossible to verify but consistent in their pattern, of encounters in which he appeared in rural villages to distribute cash, mediate disputes, or attend community events. Whether these stories were literally true or mythological accretions around a powerful figure, they reflected a genuine dynamic: the cartel as patron, as protector, as something close to authority in places where the government was absent. This dynamic is critical to understanding the title of this video. Inside the Sinaloa Cartel's massive Mexico empire, they own Mexico. The word own is doing a lot of work in that phrase, and what it means in practice is not that the cartel held title deeds to Mexican soil or collected taxes in the way a government does. What it means is that in significant portions of Mexican territory, particularly in the Northwest, the cartel exercised the functions of power more reliably and more completely than the official state. It controlled access to resources. It determined who could do business. It decided who was safe and who was not. And it did this with a consistency and a reach that the Mexican government, whatever its intentions, could not match. Now here's where things get interesting, and this is the question that analysts, researchers, and law enforcement officials have spent years trying to answer. How does an organization like this actually function at its upper levels? What does leadership look like? How are decisions made? And how did all of that change when the arrests started? Joaquin Guzman was recaptured by Mexican Marines in February 2014, following an operation that had involved months of intelligence work and several failed attempts. He was held at the Altiplano Maximum Security Prison, the most secure facility in Mexico, and within 17 months, he had escaped again through a tunnel that ran approximately 1.5 kilometers from a construction site to a hole cut through the floor of the prison shower room. The tunnel had electricity, ventilation, and a small rail system with a motorcycle. It was an engineering project of significant complexity, and it had been built without the knowledge of prison authorities who were either incompetent, willfully blind, or paid to look the other way. The escape made front pages around the world and was, in many ways, the definitive statement of the Sinaloa Cartel's reach, an illustration that even the most controlled environment in Mexico was not actually controlled when set against the organization's resources. Guzman was recaptured a third time in January 2016, extradited to the United States in January 2017, and eventually convicted in February 2019 in a federal trial in Brooklyn that produced testimony from more than 50 witnesses, including former cartel associates, government officials, and people who had worked directly for Guzman for years. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years and transferred to the ADEX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, where he remains. But the trial itself deserves its own moment of attention, because what emerged in that Brooklyn courtroom over the course of 3 months was something that no documentary, no Netflix series, and no news article had ever assembled in one place before. Witness after witness took the stand and described, under oath the interior mechanics of one of the most powerful criminal organizations ever documented in an American court. A former cartel associate described delivering suitcases of cash to Mexican government officials on Guzman's behalf. Cash that bought protection, advanced warning of raids, and the active cooperation of law enforcement in eliminating rivals. Another witness testified about the sheer scale of cocaine shipments moving through Sinaloa-controlled corridors. Tonnage so large that it was measured not in kilograms, but in the number of aircraft loads required to transport it. A former associate described a moment when Guzman personally ordered the execution of a man he suspected of disloyalty, calmly, in the middle of a conversation, with the same affect someone might use to change a television channel. The trial painted a portrait not of a swashbuckling outlaw, but of a methodical, patient, and absolutely cold-blooded executive who had built a criminal enterprise with the deliberateness of someone who intended it to last forever. And then there was October 17th, 2019, a date that people in Sinaloa will not forget. Mexican security forces attempted to arrest Ovidio Guzman Elpez, one of El Chapo's sons and an increasingly significant figure in the organization, at a house in Culiacan. Within hours, armed cartel members flooded the streets of the city in a display of force that was, to many observers, the clearest single demonstration of what cartel power actually looks like when it decides to show itself. Convoys of armed vehicles blocked major roads. Gunfights erupted across multiple parts of the city simultaneously. Citizens were trapped indoors. Soldiers were captured and used as bargaining chips. The Mexican government, facing a situation that threatened to turn Culiacan into a full-scale urban battle, made the decision to release Ovidio Guzman and stand down. The cartel had effectively faced down the Mexican state in broad daylight, in a major city, and won. The event, which Mexicans quickly named El Culiacanazo, became one of the most discussed moments in the entire history of the drug war, a stark public illustration of exactly what people mean when they say the cartel owns Mexico. But here's the thing, and this is the part of the story that matters most for understanding the organization as it exists now. The Sinaloa Cartel did not collapse when Guzman was arrested, or when he escaped, or when he was arrested again, or when he was extradited. Criminal organizations of this scale and sophistication do not depend on a single individual in the way that popular culture often suggests. The cartel had been, for years, a federated structure in which significant operational autonomy existed below the top leadership level. Regional bosses, plaza commanders, logistics coordinators, financial operators, all of these people had their own networks, their own contacts, and their own capacity to continue functioning even when the organization's most visible figure was removed from play. The man who co-founded the Sinaloa Cartel alongside Guzman, and who remained at large longer than almost anyone in the organization's history, was Ismael Zambada Garca, known as El Mayo. Where Chapo was celebrated, El Mayo was invisible. Where Chapo became a cultural figure tracked by journalists and lionized in narco corridos, El Mayo operated with a deliberate obscurity that made him, for years, more of a rumor than a documented presence. Zambada Garca was born in 1948 in a small community in Sinaloa and spent decades building his side of the organization with a focus on institutional relationships, the financial connections, the political contacts, and the internal management structures that allowed the cartel to function across generations. According to extensive reporting by journalists, including those at Insight Crime, the newspaper Ria Doce in Sinaloa, and researchers at major American universities, El Mayo's operational philosophy was fundamentally different from Guzman's. He avoided public displays of wealth. He did not cultivate a cult of personality or a popular mythology. He invested heavily in legitimate businesses and political relationships that provided cover and protection. And he survived through the entire arc of the drug war, through the rise and fall of rival organizations, through the arrest and extradition of his most famous partner, until July 2024, when he was brought to the United States under circumstances that immediately became one of the most sensational and disputed stories in the history of Mexican organized crime. The events of July 25, 2024, shocked the cartel world. El Mayo Zambada was arrested in New Mexico after arriving on a private plane, an arrival that, according to reporting, he did not know was going to end in his capture. The circumstances of his arrest generated enormous controversy in Mexico, with reporting suggesting that Zambada had been lured or deceived onto the plane by Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of El Chapo, who then cooperated with American authorities. The implications of this, that one of the organization's own senior figures had effectively delivered its founding patriarch to American law enforcement, sent shockwaves through the entire structure of the Sinaloa Cartel and touched off a period of internal conflict that, by multiple accounts, was among the most violent in the organization's history. The Sinaloa Cartel, as it exists today, is not the unified organization it once was. The period following Zambada's arrest saw a fracture between two major factions: those loyal to the Zambada family, sometimes referred to as Los Mayos, and those aligned with the Guzman family, particularly the sons of El Chapo, known as Los Chapitos. This split had been developing for some time beneath the surface, but Zambada's arrest turned a cold rivalry into open conflict. Reporting from Mexican journalists in Sinaloa, including some who have covered the cartel for decades at significant personal risk, described gun battles in the streets of Culiacan, the displacement of civilian communities, and a level of internal violence that represented a fundamental shift in how the organization was managing itself. The modern Sinaloa Cartel, in the view of most researchers and law enforcement analysts who speak publicly about it, is best understood not as a single hierarchical organization with a clear chain of command, but as a network of semi-autonomous factions that share a common origin and certain operational infrastructure, but that compete as much as they cooperate. This model, sometimes called the franchise model in organized crime research, is actually more resilient in certain respects than a strictly hierarchical structure, because it means that removing any single node, even a very important one, does not bring down the network. It simply redistributes power among the remaining nodes and creates new competition to fill the vacuum. But ironically, this resilience comes at a cost. The period of fracture and internal competition that followed El Mayo's arrest produced a level of violence in Sinaloa that affected civilian populations in ways that contradicted the cartel's historical self-presentation as a protective force in its home territory. The narco governance model depends, at least partly, on the organization maintaining order in the communities it controls, enforcing a rough peace that makes daily life possible. When internal conflict erupts, that order breaks down, and the communities that had come to rely on it find themselves caught between factions with no safe direction to turn. This is the reality that lives behind the glamour images and the mythology, and it's worth dwelling on it for a moment before we move into the final dimension of this story. Because the gap between the public image of cartel wealth and the actual experience of life inside that world is enormous. And it is a gap that the entertainment industry, the internet, and the narco corrido tradition have all been complicit in obscuring. The Sinaloa Cartel became, at some point in the 2010s, a genuinely global cultural phenomenon. Narcos Mexico on Netflix brought a version of these events to tens of millions of viewers worldwide and introduced characters based on real traffickers to audiences who had never followed the actual news from Sinaloa. The show's production values, its cinematic treatment of violence, and its willingness to humanize figures who were responsible for enormous suffering created a cultural product that was simultaneously criticized by Mexican journalists, many of whom pointed out that glamorizing these figures had real consequences in communities that still lived under their shadow, and consumed with enormous appetite by audiences everywhere else. El Chapo's biography, his escapes, his tunnels, his brief relationship with actress Kate Del Castillo that led to a now famous meeting with Sean Penn deep in the Sierra Madre, generated a kind of celebrity coverage that was unprecedented for a criminal figure. The Rolling Stone article that Penn published in January 2016, days after Guzman's third arrest, was read by millions and debated on every major news platform in the world. It treated the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere with the tone usually reserved for rock stars and film directors, and it created a moment of genuine cultural confusion about where journalism ended and myth-making began. Social media accelerated all of this in ways that would have been impossible to predict even a decade earlier. Instagram accounts linked to cartel-adjacent figures accumulated millions of followers with posts showing luxury cars, designer clothing, exotic animals, and stacks of cash, arranged with an aesthetic precision that borrowed as much from hip-hop culture as from traditional narco imagery. The comment sections of these posts were filled not with condemnation, but with admiration, with young people from communities across Mexico and Latin America who saw in these images something that their own lives lacked and that the official economy had never offered them. The cartel had learned, as thoroughly as any media company, that image is infrastructure, that the mythology you build around yourself is as important to your power as the guns you carry or the routes you control. Why did this happen? And what does it say about us that it happened? Researchers who study the sociology of organized crime point to several overlapping explanations. There is, first, the fundamental human attraction to stories of transgression, to figures who rejected the normal rules and paid no apparent price. The cartel narrative, as it filtered through popular culture, was relentlessly curated to emphasize the wealth, the freedom, and the power, while minimizing the violence, the imprisonment, the betrayal, and the death that characterized the actual experience of everyone who got close to it. Second, there is something specifically resonant about the story of someone from extreme poverty who built something enormous, even if that something was monstrous. El Chapo's origin story, the barefoot kid from a mountain village who grew up to be one of the most wanted men on earth, maps onto a narrative template that cultures around the world recognize and respond to, even when the content is horrifying. Third, and maybe most importantly for Mexico specifically, the cartel mythology speaks to something real about power and its absence. In communities where the government never showed up, where institutions never worked, where the promises of modernity never arrived, the story of someone from that same community who took matters into their own hands and built something massive carries a charge that outsiders often struggle to fully appreciate. The Narco Corrido is not glorifying crime in a vacuum. It is commenting on a distribution of power and resources that many people experience as deeply unjust, and it is celebrating, however problematically, those who found a way to move outside the boundaries of that injustice. That this celebration comes at an enormous cost to the communities it claims to represent is one of the central tragedies of the whole story. The reality behind the empire image is a place where the people who got closest to the center of power were almost always eventually consumed by it. The life expectancy of a high-ranking cartel operative is not something that gets discussed in the narco corridos. The rate of violent death, imprisonment, betrayal, and exile among the people who built and maintained the Sinaloa Cartels empire is extraordinary. The associates who testified against Guzman at his Brooklyn trial were, almost to a person, men who had spent time in American federal custody and were testifying in exchange for reduced sentences. Their descriptions of life at the top of the organization were not descriptions of invincible men living without consequences. They were descriptions of men who had spent years in hiding, moving between safe houses, unable to trust anyone around them, under constant threat of arrest or assassination, and ultimately delivered to American justice by the same network they had spent their lives building. El Chapo himself spent years in the mountains of Sinaloa, living as a fugitive inside his own empire, moving constantly, sleeping in different locations, managing an organization from a position of permanent vulnerability. The tunnels under his houses were not luxury features. They were the infrastructure of a man who understood that his world could collapse at any moment. The armored vehicles were not toys. They were the practical requirements of someone who had made enough enemies that leaving the compound without protection was not something you did. The security teams were not symbols of status. They were a constant reminder that the life you had built required an army of protection to sustain. The security teams were not symbols of status. They were a constant reminder that the life you had built required an army of protection to sustain. And here's something no one actually talks about. The people who paid the highest price for the Sinaloa Cartels empire were almost never the people at the top. They were the farmers in the Golden Triangle who grew the poppies under conditions of coercion and debt that gave them little real choice. They were the migrants who were taxed for using cartel-controlled roads. They were the journalists in Sinaloa who covered the organization and paid for that coverage with their lives. Mexico has been one of the deadliest countries in the world for journalists for more than 2 decades, and a significant portion of that violence has been concentrated in cartel-controlled states. They were the community members caught in crossfire during territorial disputes who had never had anything to do with the drug trade and who had no way out of the geography they inhabited. The empire was real, the money was real, the power was real, but the cost of that empire was distributed almost entirely downward, paid by people who had no share in its benefits and no voice in its decisions. So when we come back to the question embedded in the title, "They Own Mexico," what are we really saying? And what does it mean that this phrase resonates, that it feels like it describes something true, that people repeat it and believe it? I think what it reflects is a genuine perception of a power vacuum. Not the absence of government, exactly, but something more specific, the inadequacy of official institutions to provide what people actually need from institutions. Security, predictability, a sense that the rules apply to everyone. When those things are absent, and when a criminal organization moves into that absence and provides a rough version of them in exchange for compliance and silence, people begin to describe that organization the way they would describe a government. They own it, they run it, they are it. This is not a story unique to Mexico. Researchers who study organized crime across the globe find versions of this dynamic in every continent. Criminal organizations that fill governance voids, that provide services the state cannot or will not provide, that build loyalty through a combination of material benefit and the threat of violence. What made the Sinaloa Cartel's version of this dynamic so powerful, so durable, and so globally legible is the combination of factors that were specific to northwestern Mexico at a specific historical moment. The geography of the Sierra Madre, the poverty of the Golden Triangle communities, the specific relationship between the Mexican state and organized crime that developed through the PRI era, the proximity to the largest drug market in the world, cultural traditions of the corrido and the rancho that provided a pre-existing framework for heroizing those who operated outside the law. All of these factors combine to create conditions for the development of something that is genuinely difficult to categorize and genuinely unprecedented in the history of modern organized crime. The Sinaloa Cartel is not finished. Its current fractured state does not represent the end of the organization, only a transformation in its form. Criminal networks with this level of institutional embeddedness, this depth of penetration into economic life, political life, and community identity do not simply dissolve when their most famous leaders are removed. They adapt, they decentralize, they reconstitute around new centers of power. The question that analysts are now trying to answer is what form that reconstitution will take and what the new balance of power within the organization and between the organization and its rivals will look like as it emerges from the current period of internal conflict. What's certain is that the conditions that produced the Sinaloa Cartel have not disappeared. The poverty of the Golden Triangle has not disappeared. The demand for drugs in the United States and globally has not disappeared. The institutional weaknesses of the Mexican state have not disappeared. The cultural and social infrastructure that provides cover and legitimacy for trafficking organizations in their home territories has not disappeared. These are structural conditions, not accidents of individual biography, and they will continue to shape the criminal landscape of Mexico, regardless of what happens to any single person or any single organization. And here's something no one actually talks about. While the arrests of El Chapo and El Mayo represented genuine law enforcement victories that were years in the making, they did not represent the end of the empire those men built. They represented a transition. The empire continues, managed by different hands, structured differently, operating under different pressures, but rooted in the same geography, the same history, and the same fundamental economics of scarcity and demand that created it in the first place. The story of the Sinaloa Cartel is not finished being written. The mountains of the Golden Triangle still grow the same crops they have grown for a century. The corridors to the American border are still there. The communities that built their economic lives around the trade are still there. And somewhere in the structure that remains, changed, fractured, contested, but not gone, the next chapter of this story is already being decided. That's the empire. That's what it looks like from the inside. And that's why, when people say they own Mexico, they're not speaking loosely. They're trying to find language for something that our normal vocabulary of crime and government was never quite built to describe.